A gentle breeze rolls through the tall grass of Zambia's Kafue National Park. Birds call in the distance, their song mingling with the rustle of trees and the occasional crunch of footsteps on the dusty ground. This is a place of awe and silence. A place people come to forget their lives back home, to marvel at nature, to feel alive. But for one American couple, this dream safari would become something far more sinister. Something final. October 11th, 2016. The sun had barely broken through the horizon when a gunshot shattered the calm. A woman, beloved by many, was found dying on the floor of a hunting cabin. Her husband, calm too calm, perhaps, told authorities it was a tragic accident. A hunting rifle discharged while she packed. Just one of those freak, terrible things. But the story he told would quickly unravel. Because behind the smile of Dr. Larry Rudolph, a wealthy, well-known Pittsburgh dentist, lurks something darker. Beneath the tranquil skies of Zambia, beneath the romance of big game and safari tents, lies a story soaked in betrayal, greed, and blood. 9 life insurance policies, a secret mistress, and a trail of lies that would stretch across continents and take nearly 6 years to expose. This wasn't just a tragic mishap in the wild. This was the beginning of a cold-blooded hunt for justice. Was Bianca Rudolph the unfortunate victim of an accidental discharge? Or was she executed by the man who vowed to love and protect her? This is not just a story about death on safari. This is about a husband, a wife, a mistress, and a motive as old as time. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear changes everything. Before the headlines, before the courtroom gasps, before the gunshot echoed through the savannah, there was just Bianca and Larry Rudolph. Bianca was more than a name in a news cycle. She was warmth. She was grace. She was, to many who knew her, the definition of compassion. Born into a tight-knit Catholic family, Bianca lived a life rooted in faith, motherhood, and quiet strength. She had a laugh that could soften the hardest days and eyes that always looked like they were holding back some deeply kind secret. To her 2 children, Julian and Anna Bianca, she wasn't just mom. She was their anchor, their protector, their example. She loved animals, often more than people, which made it all the more curious that she followed Larry into the world of big game hunting. But that was Bianca, devoted, loyal to a fault, willing to step into his world, even when it wasn't hers. And then there's Larry, Dr. Lawrence Rudolph. Flashy, confident, successful. A man who built an empire of dental offices in Pittsburgh. To the outside world, he was the image of the American dream. A self-made man, millionaire dentist, frequent flyer, hunting aficionado. He wasn't shy about showing off either. Private jets, African safaris, designer watches. Larry didn't just enjoy the finer things in life. He demanded them. Where Bianca was soft-spoken, Larry was commanding. Where she found peace and simplicity, he craved spectacle. Together, they looked like a power couple. 34 years of marriage, 2 grown kids, a lifetime of vacations and photos and family dinners. The kind of marriage others would envy, at least on the surface. But like most seemingly perfect pictures, this one had its cracks. People close to them knew that Larry could be controlling. That he liked things his way, and only his way, that the charm he showed in public could shift behind closed doors. Bianca, ever patient, ever gracious, kept the peace. She smiled. She supported. She followed him to Africa more than once, joining in on the hunts he loved, posing beside the animals he had killed. But behind every trip, every dinner party, every polished photo, something was brewing. Something dark. Something that even those closest to them couldn't fully see until it was too late. Because while Bianca devoted herself to her family, Larry had other interests. This isn't just a story about 2 people on vacation. This is about how a marriage, built over decades, can hide secrets deeper than anyone dares to admit. It's about how the people we trust most can become the ones we fear the most. And in the case of Larry and Bianca Rudolph, it's about how love can become lethal. It was supposed to be their last morning in Zambia, October 11th, 2016. The sun had just begun to stretch across the golden plains of Kafue National Park. Birds darted between trees. The air was still calm, the kind of peace that tricks you into thinking nothing could go wrong. Bianca was packing. Their bags lay open in the modest hunting lodge they had called home for the past 10 days. A successful safari. Larry had taken down several animals, including a prized leopard, and Bianca had reportedly shot a hippo. They were both experienced hunters, familiar with firearms. This wasn't their first safari, and it wouldn't be their last. At least, that's what everyone thought. According to Larry's story, he had gone into the bathroom to brush his teeth. Bianca, he said, was across the room, packing a shotgun into a soft case. Then, suddenly a blast. Larry emerged to find his wife collapsed. Blood pooled beneath her, a wound to her chest. A single shot from the shotgun had pierced her heart. He claimed the gun had accidentally discharged while she was trying to put away. It was a tragic accident, he told the authorities. A heartbreaking freak moment. But almost immediately, things didn't add up. First, the timing. Larry said it all happened in a flash. He heard the blast and came running. Yet, strangely, he was composed when park rangers arrived. Too composed. The kind of calm that raises eyebrows. Not a man screaming in grief, not someone in shock. He gave instructions, made calls. Focused. Collected. Then came the body. Bianca's remains were cremated almost immediately, within days. Her body never made it home. No funeral, no burial, just ashes. Larry insisted it was what she would have wanted. But to those who knew her, that didn't make sense. Bianca was a devout Catholic, and she had told friends on multiple occasions that she didn't believe in cremation. She wanted to be buried. The idea of cremation, in her mind, was against her faith. So why would Larry authorize it so quickly? And then the gun itself. The shotgun in question was a Browning 12-gauge double barrel. Not exactly the kind of weapon that discharges without significant force. Investigators would later testify that for the gun to fire, the safety had to be off, the trigger pulled firmly, and the barrel pointed directly at the target. Bianca would have had to mishandle the gun with alarming precision to cause a fatal shot directly to her chest. But there was more. Inside the lodge, investigators found a trail of inconsistencies. The gun case she was supposedly packing wasn't zipped. There was no blood on it, no sign it had even been touched. The gun was found beneath Bianca's body, not beside the suitcase where she was packing it. There were questions about the angle of the shot, the distance, the lack of powder burns on her hands. It didn't look like an accident. It looked deliberate. And quietly, the whispers began. Back in the States, her friends began asking questions. Her children were confused. The U.S. consular official who visited the scene had a gut feeling. Something wasn't right. Why was Larry in such a rush to have her cremated? Why did his story seem so rehearsed, so polished? A beloved wife was dead. Her husband was already preparing to move on. And a long, tangled web of truth and deception was about to unravel. This wasn't just a tragic end to a vacation. This was the start of something far more sinister. Just days after the fatal gunshot echoed through the Zambian bush, Bianca Rudolph's body was reduced to ashes. The decision to cremate her was swift. Too swift. According to Larry, it was what Bianca would have wanted. He told local authorities she had no objections. He told the funeral director she wanted it done quickly, before shipping a body became a bureaucratic nightmare. He signed the documents. He arranged the transport. Within 72 hours of her death, she was gone. No viewing. No autopsy in the U.S. No funeral. Just ashes. And for many of Bianca's closest friends, this wasn't just unusual. It was unthinkable. Bianca was a devout Catholic. Her faith wasn't some casual part of her life. It was foundational. The sacraments, the rituals, the traditions, they mattered deeply to her. She attended Mass. She prayed regularly. She had even spoken directly and unambiguously about her end-of-life wishes. She did not believe in cremation. To her, It was a violation of the sacred process of returning to the earth whole. So when her friends heard that Larry had arranged a cremation, they were stunned. He lied. One friend would later say, "She never wanted that. She told me that more than once." It wasn't just the cremation that raised red flags, it was the speed. There had been no time for a second opinion, no time for the family to process what had happened. It was as if Larry wanted the evidence gone before anyone had a chance to ask questions. And someone did ask questions. Kevin Amandi, the U.S. Consular Chief in Zambia, arrived at the scene shortly after the shooting. He walked through the hunting lodge. He examined the positioning of Bianca's body. He looked at the gun, the suitcase, the blood. And something about the story Larry told didn't sit right. For a supposed accident, it all felt too neat, too choreographed. Amandi noted Larry's demeanor. Cool, unshaken, strangely professional for a man who had just lost his wife of 3 decades. He didn't see grief. He saw control. He documented everything, every angle, every comment. He made his suspicions known in his official report. And that report, dismissed at first, would later become a critical piece of evidence. Back in the United States, whispers were turning into questions, and questions into quiet outrage. Why was there no funeral? Why was there no body? Why was Larry already back in Pittsburgh, moving forward as if nothing had happened? And then word began to spread. 9 life insurance policies, millions of dollars, a mistress waiting in the wings. What had started as grief was slowly evolving into suspicion. Something wasn't adding up, and people were beginning to ask the question no one had dared say out loud. Did Larry Rudolph kill his wife? Or worse, had he planned it all along? When someone dies suddenly, unexpectedly, it's natural to look for answers. Grief demands clarity, closure. And in the days following Bianca Rudolph's death, as her ashes cooled and Larry returned to life in Pennsylvania, those closest to her started digging. Not just emotionally, but legally, financially. What they found would set off alarms far louder than the gunshot that ended her life. 9. That's the number of life insurance policies Larry Rudolph had taken out on his wife. Not 1, not 2, 9. Some relatively small, others shockingly large. And the total payout? Just under $4.8 million. $4,800,000. All collected by a man who had already authorized her cremation. A man who had shown little visible grief. A man who wasted no time making claims. At first, the insurance companies didn't question it. The death certificate listed an accident. The story had been repeated enough times it sounded clean. She was packing a shotgun and it fired. Tragic, but plausible on paper. But one insurer had doubts. Quiet, persistent doubts. They reached out to federal authorities, not to accuse, but to inquire. And in 2020, years after Bianca's death, the FBI got involved. The Bureau didn't jump to conclusions. They rarely do. They started the way they always start. Small. Documents. Paper trails. Phone records. Bank accounts. And what they found was unsettling. First, the timeline. Larry claimed the policies were just part of smart financial planning. But some had been increased just months before Bianca's death. Others had outdated beneficiaries, replaced quietly with his name. Then came the disability claim. Years earlier, Larry had made headlines, quietly, when he claimed that a crocodile bite left him permanently disabled during a different safari. He was awarded a hefty monthly payout, over $30,000. Yet photographs and travel records showed a man traveling the world, hunting game, appearing perfectly healthy. It was, investigators believed, a clear sign. This wasn't a man afraid to bend the truth for a payday. Now, the FBI wasn't just investigating a tragic accident. They were investigating potential insurance fraud, obstruction, and, most seriously, premeditated murder. The agents assigned to the case dug deep into the couple's life. Travel records, luggage weights, firearm ballistics, emails, and phone calls, hundreds of them, especially between Larry and a woman he had kept quiet about in the aftermath of Bianca's death. Her name was Lori Milleron. And what began as an investigation into paperwork was quickly shifting into a hunt for motive. Because if Larry Rudolph didn't just benefit financially from his wife's death, but orchestrated it, then this wasn't about life insurance. It was about betrayal. It was about greed. And it was about a man who may have decided that the woman who shared his life was worth more to him dead than alive. As the FBI's investigation intensified, the pieces of Larry Rudolph's story, so carefully arranged, began to fall apart. It wasn't just the suspicion. It wasn't just the insurance money. It was the forensics. Cold, clinical, unforgiving science. The kind that doesn't care how convincing someone sounds. The kind that tells the truth when people won't. The Browning 12-gauge shotgun Bianca had supposedly been packing? It wasn't likely to have fired the way Larry claimed. Not unless someone pulled the trigger. Hard. And not unless the muzzle was aimed directly at her chest from several feet away. A world-renowned ballistics expert analyzed the case. Meticulously. He reviewed the photos, the autopsy findings, the wound trajectory. And then he issued a statement that would send chills down the spine of everyone watching. The shot, he said, was fired from 6 to 8 feet away. Not inches. Not point blank. Feet. Bianca couldn't have shot herself by accident, not unless she was somehow stretching out a shotgun and contorting herself in ways that defied logic and physics. It simply wasn't possible. The angle of the wound, the pattern of the spray, the absence of gunpowder residue on her hands or clothes. It all told the same story. She didn't do this. Someone else did. And all fingers were pointing toward Larry. But there was more. FBI agents uncovered discrepancies in the travel itinerary Larry had provided. He had told authorities they were rushing to get home because Bianca had a dental appointment, that she wanted to get back quickly. But there was no record of such an appointment. No emails. No reminders. Nothing in the calendar. The urgency, it seemed, was fabricated. Then came the luggage. A report from the airline showed their bags were overweight. Odd, considering Bianca's hunting gear, including the shotgun, had supposedly been packed in a soft case. Yet the weight didn't reflect that. It reflected something heavier. As if, perhaps, the weapon wasn't packed by her at all, but used for something else entirely. And Larry? He was caught in multiple lies. He told one version of events to the Zambian police, a slightly altered version to the U.S. consulate, a third, more polished version to the insurance companies. And then, when the FBI began asking questions, his memory grew hazy. He backtracked, rephrased, reframed. But facts don't bend. Not when they've been burned into forensic evidence. It wasn't just that Larry's story didn't hold up. It was that Bianca's death had the fingerprints, metaphorical and perhaps literal, of careful planning. The lies were unraveling. The clock was ticking. And the man who once claimed to be a grieving husband was now looking more and more like a prime suspect in cold-blooded murder. It took 5 years. 5 long, meticulous, quietly furious years. From the moment Bianca Rudolph died in that lodge in Zambia, to the cold December morning in 2021 when federal agents surrounded Dr. Larry Rudolph at his Arizona home and placed him under arrest. The charge, murder of his wife on foreign soil. For the friends who had waited. For the children who had wrestled with doubt. For the investigators who had worked in silence, often facing skepticism. It was the moment they had hoped for and feared might never come. But this wasn't just going to be a murder trial. This was going to be a dissection of a life, of a marriage, of a man who had spent years playing both sides of the truth. In July 2022, the trial began in Denver, Colorado. The courtroom buzzed with press, with curiosity, with anticipation. What the prosecution had wasn't just theory. It was a carefully constructed, devastating narrative. The first blow came from the FBI's forensic evidence, and it was damning. Bianca could not have accidentally shot herself. The shot came from several feet away. Larry's version of events didn't match physics, didn't match wounds, didn't match facts. But the prosecution didn't stop there. They introduced the affair. Lori Milleron, Larry's longtime mistress, his office manager, the woman he flew around the world with. the woman he had reportedly promised a future to. And then, one of the biggest bombshells of the entire trial came from a bartender, a man who had worked at a steakhouse in Phoenix. Years earlier, he claimed he had overheard Larry speaking loudly at the bar. And the words he remembered? "I killed my FING wife for you." The courtroom froze. It was messy, yes. Imperfect. Hearsay, perhaps. But it cut through the noise. It was raw, unfiltered. It painted a picture of a man who had been drinking, maybe let his guard down, maybe let something slip, maybe, just maybe, told the truth. And then came the emails. Private messages between Larry and Lori Milleron. In them, the tone was intimate, familiar, frustrated. One stood out. Lori had written, "I will not wait forever. I need you to make a decision." The prosecution called it what it was, an ultimatum. Larry's double life was starting to strain. He wanted Lori, but he had Bianca. Divorce was expensive, complicated, messy. But death? Death was final. Death solved the problem. And to a man who had already once faked disability for money, what was another lie? The courtroom watched Larry's face closely as the evidence mounted. He sat straight, stoic. But behind those eyes, you could see it. The unraveling. Witness by witness. Document by document. The picture became clearer. A man who wanted freedom. A mistress who was tired of waiting. A life insurance jackpot worth millions. And a wife who trusted him enough to go on one last safari. The jury listened. The public followed every detail. And for the first time, Larry Rudolph was no longer in control. He was cornered, exposed, and the truth was finally dragging him into the light. It didn't take long. After weeks of gripping testimony, forensic science, damning emails, and one unforgettable alleged confession at a bar, the jury came back with a verdict that would forever change the life of Dr. Larry Rudolph and confirm the darkest fears of Bianca's family and friends. Guilty. Guilty of murdering his wife in a foreign country. Guilty of mail fraud for claiming nearly $5 million in life insurance. The man who once flew first class around the world, who posed proudly with the wild animals he killed, who charmed clients in his Pittsburgh dental empire, would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. At sentencing, the courtroom sat in weighted silence as the judge addressed him. Life in federal prison. No possibility of parole. No more luxury. No more freedom. And on top of that, a staggering $4.8 million in restitution to the insurance companies he deceived and an additional $2 million fine. In total, nearly $6.9 million. Money gained by a lie that had cost a woman her life. But Larry wasn't the only one held accountable. Lori Milleron, the woman who had waited on the sidelines for years, who had sent the emails urging Larry to make a decision, who had stood by his side even as the world crumbled around him, was charged too. Obstruction, perjury, being an accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. In the final moments of the trial, the prosecution laid it all bare. They didn't mince words. They didn't dress it up. They delivered their closing argument like a scalpel. This was never an accident. This was not a husband grieving his wife. This was not a moment of tragic misfortune on a safari. This was a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as an obstacle. She was in the way of his freedom, of his future, of his mistress. And so he did what hunters do when they see something standing between them and their goal. He eliminated it. For money, for freedom, for desire. A woman was killed in cold blood. And the man who pulled the trigger tried to make the world believe it was a mistake. But the jury didn't believe it. The court didn't believe it. And now, after years of evasion, of lies, of arrogance, Larry Rudolph would finally pay the price. Not with money, but with his life. For Larry Rudolph, the verdict was the end of the road. But for Bianca's children, it was the beginning of something far more painful. Julian and Anna Bianca had stood behind their father at first. Why wouldn't they? He was the man who raised them, who built a life with their mother, who sent them to school, told them bedtime stories, paid for their first cars. In those early days, when the reports from Zambia came through, they believed his version. The accident, the tragedy, the loss. But as time passed and the truth began to leak through the cracks in Larry's story, that belief began to splinter. Emails, testimony, the money, the mistress, the sudden cremation, their mother's faith erased with the stroke of a pen. Each detail was another knife, another betrayal, and eventually it became impossible to ignore. Their father hadn't just lied to the world. He had lied to them. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. But for Julian and Anna Bianca, it wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a funeral of a different kind. Not just the death of their mother, but the death of who they thought their father was. And you don't get to bury that twice. But the pain didn't stop there. What followed was a bitter, tangled legal battle. One that no child ever imagines fighting against a parent, even one now convicted of murder. The government moved swiftly to seize Larry's assets, aiming to recoup the $4.8 million in insurance fraud. But complications quickly arose. Larry had transferred wealth, shifted accounts, entangled his estate in ways that made it hard to follow. And the children? They were stuck in the middle, fighting not for inheritance, but for truth, for the memory of their mother, for the principle that her life couldn't just be reduced to a dollar sign on a death certificate. That fight continues, quietly, in courtrooms and legal filings. But Bianca's story, her real story, didn't end in Zambia. Her legacy lives on, whispered through the people who knew her best, through the charities she supported, the friends who still light candles in her name, the daughter who now speaks out about domestic violence, the son who stands for accountability, even when it costs everything. Bianca Rudolph was more than a murder victim. She was a wife, a mother, a woman of faith, a beacon of kindness in a world that too often turns cruel. And while her life ended in silence, her memory now speaks louder than her killer ever could. Because justice may have come late, but it came. And in that, there is something Bianca was always known for: grace. By the summer of 2025, the story of Bianca and Larry Rudolph had already captivated the justice system. Now, it would captivate the world. On July 21st, Hulu released a new true crime docuseries, Trophy Wife: Murder on Safari. The title was provocative, the imagery haunting, but the content? It was like opening a door that had been locked for far too long. For the first time, viewers were taken behind the headlines. The documentary peeled back the layers with surgical precision, interviews with FBI agents who had worked the case for years, pouring through bank records, cell data, and email trails. Prosecutors who relived the moment, they realized this wasn't a case of negligence, but cold-blooded intent. There were voices from Zambia, too. Local guides who remembered the couple's final safari. Staff who noted Larry's oddly composed demeanor just hours after Bianca's death. Those who had stood in that cabin, feet from where Bianca fell, now given a voice. Bianca's friends and family were present too, some speaking for the first time on camera, their voices quivering but resolute. They talked about who she really was, what her faith meant to her, and how the man she trusted the most stole everything from her. And, of course, there were the co-workers, people who had worked at Larry's dental offices, who described a man with two faces, charming in public, intimidating in private. Some spoke of Lori Milleron. Others admitted they'd always felt something was off. But beyond the evidence, beyond the timeline and forensic animations, the series did something else. It asked why. Why are we so obsessed with stories like this? Why do tales of betrayal, of greed, of privilege gone wrong grip us so tightly? Maybe it's because stories like this remind us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles in family photos. Sometimes it books the safari. And sometimes it lives in the same house for 34 years. The public responded immediately. Social media lit up with theories, outrage, heartbreak. Hashtags trended. Viewers dissected every detail. The show sparked conversations about wealth manipulation, the justice system, and the invisible warning signs that so many people miss until it's too late. But more than anything, it reignited a conversation about Bianca. Not just her death, but her life, her grace, her loyalty, her story. In a world that too often turns victims into footnotes, the docuseries did something remarkable. It gave her the final word. And it reminded everyone watching that the true crime genre isn't about morbid curiosity. It's about memory. It's about justice. And it's about making sure that people like Bianca Rudolph are never forgotten. So here we are. A woman gone far too soon. A man convicted of her murder. Millions of dollars. A hidden affair. And a safari that ended not in photographs and souvenirs, but in a funeral no one could attend. Bianca Rudolph's death shook her family, her friends, and eventually the entire justice system. It revealed how deception can wear a smile, how trust can be manipulated, and how a lifetime of devotion can be erased in a single calculated moment. But as we close this story, we're left with bigger questions. Questions that don't fit neatly into headlines. Did justice prevail? Some would say yes, Larry Rudolph is serving life in prison. The system worked. The lies caught up. The truth came out. But others might point to the years it took. The ashes scattered before an autopsy could ever be done. The manipulation of people, paperwork, and perceptions. The pain endured by Bianca's children, watching their father fall from grace and discovering that the person they once trusted most was capable of the unthinkable. And then there's this. Was this preventable? Were there signs? Could anyone have stopped this? Could Bianca herself have seen it coming? Or was she too loyal, too trusting, too deep into the life they built to ever imagine the man beside her would choose freedom over her existence? We may never truly know. But what we do know is this. Stories like Bianca's matter. They deserve to be told, not sensationalized, but remembered. They're not about entertainment. They're about awareness. About honoring lives taken and learning how to see the signs, speak up, and protect those around us before it's too late. So now it's your turn. You've heard the evidence. You've followed the trail. You've seen the affair, the emails, the inconsistencies, the courtroom gasps. You've walked through the tragedy, step by painful step. Now, I want to hear from you. What's your verdict? Was this love or premeditated murder? Comment below. Tell me what you believe happened that morning in Zambia. And most importantly, remember Bianca, not for how her life ended, but for how fully and fiercely she lived. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and never forget the stories that still echo in the silence.